All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're unpacking a huge case that puts school authority and student privacy head to head. It's one of those stories that starts small, with a 13-year-old, a couple of ibuprofen pills, and then just explodes, going all the way to the Supreme Court. It really sparked a national conversation about what rights students actually have once they walk through those school doors. And that brings us to the big question, the one that's at the very heart of this whole thing. When it comes to keeping our schools safe, how far is just too far? It's a question that every student, parent, and teacher has probably thought about, and it's the central legal puzzle in the case of Safford Unified School District versus Reading. But before we get tangled up in all the legal arguments, we've got to start with the human story. Because this isn't some abstract thought experiment. This was a very real and, honestly, a deeply personal experience for a middle schooler. And believe it or not, it all started over a search for ibuprofen. So check out how fast this whole thing escalated. It kicks off when another student gets caught with some prescription-strength ibuprofen and points the finger at Savannah Redding. So the assistant principal pulls Savannah in, questions her, searches her backpack, finds nothing. But he doesn't stop. He takes her to the nurse, and that's where she's told to take off her clothes. And the kicker, after all of that, they still found absolutely nothing. And it's so important we remember exactly who we're talking about here. Savannah Redding wasn't a student with a long disciplinary record or anything like that. She was a 13-year-old honor student. And that detail actually becomes pretty crucial later on when the court starts weighing whether the school's actions were, reasonable. So, yeah, this one single event in one middle school in Arizona suddenly blows up into this massive constitutional question. It becomes a major legal showdown, and it all revolves around one of the most fundamental rights we have. And that right is spelled out in the Fourth Amendment. This is the part of the Constitution that protects us from unreasonable searches and seizures. Now, for police out on the street, that usually means they need a warrant, and to get a warrant, they need probable cause, which is a pretty high legal bar to clear. But schools, well, they play by a different set of rules. And this right here is where things get super interesting. See, a previous Supreme Court case had already set a different standard for schools. They don't need that high bar of probable cause. All they need is reasonable suspicion. It's a much lower bar, and it was created to give schools the flexibility they need to keep things safe and orderly. So that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The one the Supreme Court had to figure out. Even with this lower, more flexible standard of reasonable suspicion, was it reasonable to make a 13-year-old girl strip down to her underwear to look for some painkillers? The whole case really came down to what that one word, reasonable, actually means in a school hallway. So how did most of the justices see it? Well, their final opinion, which was written by Justice David Souter, really hammered home one powerful idea, that this search was, in their words, excessively intrusive. This quote from Justice Souter really cuts right to the chase. He wasn't saying the school had zero reason to be suspicious. What he was saying is that the suspicion they did have just didn't justify the way they searched. The dots just didn't connect to taking off her clothes. So you can think of the majority's argument like a balancing act. On one side of the scale, you have what the school is looking for, ibuprofen. We're not talking about a weapon or hardcore drugs here. But on the other side of the scale, you have the search itself, something the court flat out called embarrassing, frightening, and humiliating for a teenager. For them, that scale tipped, and it tipped hard. The search was way too intrusive for the offense they suspected. But this wasn't a 9-0 slam dunk. There was one justice who dissented, Clarence Thomas, and he saw this whole thing through a completely different lens. For him, it was all about the school's fundamental need to maintain order. And this quote from Justice Thomas really sums up his whole argument. He's basically saying, who are me as judges to sit back in our chambers and second-guess the tough, real-time decisions that school officials have to make every single day to keep kids safe?
For Justice Thomas, the logic was pretty straightforward. Look, schools have an anti-drug policy for a reason. A student said Savannah had the pills. And in his view, it's just common sense that a kid trying to hide something might use their underwear. So for him, the search, while maybe not ideal, was a justified way to enforce the rules and keep drugs out of the school.
Okay, so there you have it. Two powerful, completely opposite arguments. A student's individual right to privacy versus the school's need for safety and order. So, how did the court finally rule, and what was the lasting impact? The final vote came in, and it wasn't even close. It was 8-1. The vast majority of the court sided with Savannah Redding, sending a really strong message that what the school did had crossed a constitutional line. But here's where the decision gets a little complicated. It was actually a two-part ruling.
First, the court made it official the strip search did violate Savannah's Fourth Amendment rights. It was unconstitutional. But, and this is a really big but, they also said the school officials couldn't be sued for it. That's because of something called qualified immunity. The court basically said that back when this happened, the law about student strip searches wasn't clear enough for the officials to have known they were breaking it.
So while the individual school officials were protected from being sued, the school district as a whole was not. And the whole ordeal finally came to a close when the district settled with Savannah Redding's family for $250,000.
And that leaves us with this huge question to chew on. The Supreme Court has said time and again that students don't shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. But what a case like this shows us is that those rights, well, they look a little different inside a school. So the question we're left with is, should they be? And where exactly do we draw the line between keeping students safe and protecting their basic privacy?